In the year 123 BCE, the Roman Republic passed a law that seemed like pure genius, a law that promised to feed the hungry, stabilize society, and secure political power for generations. It was called the Lex Sempronia Frumentaria, the Grain Law, and it would take nearly 500 years, but this single piece of legislation would help bring the greatest civilization the world had ever known to its knees. This is the story of how free bread destroyed Rome. Not through war, not through plague, not through barbarian invasion, but through a promise that seemed too good to refuse and a system that became impossible to stop. To understand how this law came to be, we need to go back to the 2nd century BCE, when Rome was conquering the world but destroying itself from within. Rome had just defeated Carthage. They'd crushed Macedonia. Spain was theirs. Asia Minor was theirs. Wealth was pouring into the city like never before. But there was a problem. All that wealth was going to the wrong people. The Roman elite, the senators, the generals, the old aristocratic families, they were getting unimaginably rich. They bought up massive estates called latifundia, plantations worked by the thousands of slaves Rome's wars had captured. Meanwhile, the small farmers who had actually fought in those wars, they came home to find their farms ruined, their families in debt, and cheap grain from conquered provinces flooding the market, making it impossible to compete. Thousands of Roman citizens were abandoning their ancestral land and flooding into the city of Rome itself, desperate, angry, and hungry. By 130 BCE, Rome had a population crisis. Over 300,000 people crammed into the city. Unemployment was rampant. Food prices were volatile and controlled by grain merchants who could charge whatever they wanted. And here's the thing about ancient Rome. There was no police force, no welfare system, no safety net. What Rome did have was a tradition. Wealthy politicians would occasionally distribute free or cheap grain to win popularity. It was called a frumentatio, a grain handout. But these were temporary, sporadic, a political stunt here and there, until one man decided to make it permanent. His name was Gaius Gracchus, and in 123 BCE, he was elected tribune of the plebs, essentially the people's champion. Gaius Gracchus was not a demagogue. He was a genuine reformer from one of Rome's most respected families. His older brother Tiberius had tried to redistribute land to poor farmers and been murdered by the Senate for it. Gaius was smarter, more strategic. He knew that if he could secure the loyalty of Rome's urban poor, if he could guarantee them something concrete, something they could count on every single month, he could build a political power base that even the Senate couldn't touch. So he proposed the Lex Sempronia Frumentaria. The law was simple. Every Roman citizen living in the city would be entitled to buy a fixed amount of grain, about 33 kilograms per month, at a subsidized price far below market rate. The state would buy grain in bulk from Sicily and other provinces, store it in massive warehouses, and sell it to citizens at a loss. The difference would be made up from Rome's treasury, which, after decades of conquest, was overflowing. The Senate was horrified, not because they cared about the cost. Rome could afford it. They were horrified because they understood what this really meant. Gaius Gracchus was creating a permanent voting bloc, a class of citizens who would support any politician who promised to maintain or expand the grain dole. The Senator Cato the Younger allegedly said, "You are not feeding the people, you are buying them." But he was too late. The law passed with overwhelming support. And on the day the first grain distributions began, over 40,000 Roman citizens lined up outside the public granaries. They cheered, they celebrated, they blessed Gracchus's name. They had no idea what they'd just done. For the first 2 decades, everything seemed fine. Actually, better than fine. Political violence in Rome decreased. Citizens had reliable access to food. The poor weren't rioting. Politicians loved it because supporting the grain dole was guaranteed popularity. In 58 BCE, a populist politician named Clodius Pulcher went even further. He made the grain completely free, not subsidized, free, zero cost to recipients. By this point, around 320,000 people, nearly half the adult male population of Rome, were receiving the grain dole. Think about that number. 320,000 people. That's more than the population of medieval London, more than Renaissance Florence, all dependent on the state for their basic food supply. Here's where the problem started. Slowly, invisibly, like rot spreading through wood. Problem number 1. Nobody wanted to farm anymore. Why would you break your back farming wheat outside Rome when you could move to the city and get free grain? Italian agriculture began to collapse. The small family farms that had been the backbone of the Roman Republic abandoned. More and more, Rome became dependent on grain from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. Problem number 2. Nobody wanted to work low-wage jobs. Why would you work in a bakery or a mill or do manual labor when the state gave you enough grain to survive? Business owners couldn't find workers. Wages had to rise dramatically for unpleasant jobs. The economy started distorting around this massive intervention. Problem number 3. The grain dole became politically untouchable. Any politician who even suggested reducing it was committing political suicide. Julius Caesar tried to reform it in 46 BCE, cutting the rolls from 320,000 down to 150,000 by removing people who didn't qualify. He was assassinated 2 years later. Now, that wasn't why he was killed, but it didn't help his popularity with the masses. By the time Augustus became Rome's first emperor in 27 BCE, the grain dole wasn't just a welfare program. It was the single largest logistical operation in the ancient world. Every year, Rome needed to import approximately 400,000 tons of grain. That's the cargo capacity of about 1,600 large merchant ships. Egypt alone sent a fleet of grain ships, the Classis Alexandrina, carrying 150,000 tons annually. The entire port of Ostia was redesigned just to handle grain imports. Massive warehouses were built. A new artificial harbor was constructed. Thousands of workers were employed just to move grain from ships to storage to distribution points. The Roman state created a bureaucracy called the Praefectus Annone, the prefect of the grain supply, one of the most powerful positions in the empire. This official controlled the food supply of the capital. If he failed, Rome would riot. And here's the horrifying part. The system had become too big to fail. If the grain shipments stopped for even a few weeks, hundreds of thousands of people would starve. Rome had built a trap and locked itself inside. By 100 AD, something had fundamentally changed in Roman culture. Receiving the grain dole wasn't seen as emergency relief. It was seen as a right, an entitlement that came with citizenship. Generations of Romans had now grown up never having to worry about food. The dole wasn't just economic policy, it had shaped the psychology of the population. The poet Juvenal famously wrote that the Roman people, who once gave commands and elected consuls, now only cared about 2 things: panem et circenses, bread and circuses. free grain, and free entertainment. Political participation declined. Why riot or rebel when you're fed? Why care about distant wars when you're comfortable? The grain dole created what we might today call learned helplessness on a civilizational scale. But the emperors loved it. Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, they all maintained and even expanded the program. Because here's the dark truth. The grain dole wasn't really about helping the poor. It was about control. A fed population is a docile population. And as long as the grain kept flowing, the emperors could do almost anything else without facing serious revolt. By the 2nd century AD, cracks were showing. The Roman treasury wasn't as flush as it used to be. The easy conquests were over. The empire had stopped expanding, but the grain dole? That kept growing. By now, it wasn't just grain. Emperors added olive oil, pork, wine, even free tickets to gladiatorial games. The annona, the food distribution system, consumed an estimated 15 to 20% of the imperial budget. And the numbers kept climbing. Historians estimate that by 250 AD, potentially 500,000 people in Rome and other major cities were dependent on state food distributions. Meanwhile, the empire's tax base was shrinking. Farms were abandoned, trade routes were threatened by barbarians, inflation was rising. The government tried everything, debasing the currency, raising taxes on provinces, forcing people into hereditary occupations, but they couldn't touch the grain dole. One emperor who tried, Aurelian, in 274 AD, faced immediate riots. He gave up and instead expanded the program, adding free rations of pork and wine. The addiction was complete. The 3rd century AD was when everything started falling apart. Between 235 and 284 AD, just 50 years, Rome had at least 50 different emperors. Most died violently. Plague swept through the empire. Barbarian tribes pushed at every border. Civil wars erupted constantly. And through it all, the grain dole continued. Even as the empire was collapsing, even as armies went unpaid, even as infrastructure crumbled, the grain ships still sailed to Rome. Because everyone understood, if the food stopped, Rome would burn. In 270 AD, the Vandals cut off grain shipments from North Africa for several months. The result? Mass riots, thousands dead. Emperor Claudius Gothicus had to personally lead military expeditions to reopen the supply lines, not to fight strategic wars, but to get food to the capital. The grain dole had become Rome's greatest vulnerability. Enemies didn't need to besiege the city. They just needed to cut off the grain fleet. In 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian made a radical decision. The empire was too big, too complex, too expensive to manage as one unit. So, he split it in half. The Western Empire, centered in Rome, the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople. And here's where the grain dole sealed Rome's fate. Constantinople, the new eastern capital, had its own grain supply from Egypt and the Black Sea. Rome, the old western capital, was now competing for resources with the wealthier, more stable East. Guess who won that competition? By 330 AD, Emperor Constantine officially moved the capital of the empire to Constantinople. Rome, the eternal city, was no longer the center of the Roman Empire. Why? Partly strategic, partly political, but also because feeding Rome had become an unbearable burden. Constantinople was easier to supply, more defensible, less dependent on a single vulnerable supply chain. Rome, with its hundreds of thousands of grain dole recipients, had become a liability. The 4th and 5th centuries were the death spiral. Rome's population began to shrink. The wealthy moved away. Tax revenue collapsed. But the grain dole remained. Fewer and fewer people were supporting more and more dependents. The Western Roman government was spending approximately 30 to 40% of its entire budget just on food distributions. Not roads, not armies, not aqueducts, food. And they couldn't stop, because by now, multiple generations of Romans had never known anything else. Working for a living, growing food, that was for provincials and barbarians. Real Romans received the annona. Even as Gothic tribes raided Italy, even as the city's population dropped from perhaps 1 million in 100 AD to maybe 200,000 by 400 AD, the grain dole continued. It's one of the most surreal images in history, a dying empire, barely able to defend itself, still operating a massive welfare bureaucracy to feed a capital that no longer mattered. In August of 410 AD, the Visigothic king Alaric did something no one had done in 800 years. He sacked Rome. But here's what's less well known. Before the attack, Alaric had besieged the city for months. And his strategy wasn't to assault the walls, it was to cut off the grain supply. No ships from North Africa, no caravans from Sicily. For the first time in centuries, the grain dole stopped. The result was catastrophic. Starvation spread through the city. Some historians record instances of cannibalism. The price of food became astronomical, but there was no food to buy at any price. When Alaric finally breached the walls, through treachery, not force, he found a population that was already defeated, not by his armies, by hunger. The grain dole had made Rome powerful. Then it made Rome dependent. And then it made Rome vulnerable. And when that vulnerability was finally exploited, Rome had no resilience left, no ability to adapt, no memory of how to feed itself. Rome would limp on for another 66 years. The grain dole, incredibly, continued in reduced form, but the damage was done. In 455 AD, the Vandals, now controlling North Africa, sacked Rome again. The grain supply was permanently disrupted. In 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. The date traditionally marks the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and one of Odoacer's first acts? He officially ended the grain dole. There was no money to pay for it, no infrastructure to manage it, no centralized state to organize it. After 600 years, the system finally died, and Rome's population collapsed completely. Within a generation, the city that had housed over 1 million people had perhaps 30,000 residents. The Forum was abandoned, the Colosseum crumbled, aqueducts broke and were never repaired. Medieval Rome would be built in the ruins of classical Rome, a fraction of its size, a shadow of its power. And the grain dole, the law that was supposed to save Rome, had helped destroy it. So let's be clear about what actually happened here. The grain dole didn't destroy Rome overnight. It was slow poison that took 6 centuries to work. Here's how it killed. First, it destroyed the agricultural economy. When the state guarantees your food, why farm? Italian agriculture never recovered from the grain dole. By the 4th century, Italy, which had once fed itself, imported nearly all its food. When those imports stopped, there was no local capacity to make up the difference. Second, it created unsustainable fiscal burdens. The grain dole started as maybe 5% of the budget. By the end, it was 30 to 40%. That's money that couldn't go to the military, infrastructure, education, or anything else. Rome was spending more on feeding its capital than on defending its borders. Third, it made the economy rigid and fragile. Markets work because prices signal information. When grain is cheap, farmers grow more. When it's expensive, people consume less. The grain dole broke that mechanism. Rome became locked into a system where massive amounts of resources were permanently allocated to one function, regardless of whether it made economic sense. Fourth, it created perverse political incentives. No politician could win by being responsible. The only way to gain power was to promise more free stuff. The grain dole ratcheted up over time because reduction was political death. This is called the ratchet effect. Benefits are easy to create and nearly impossible to remove. But the economic damage was only half the story. The grain dole did something worse. It changed who Romans were. Remember the early Roman Republic? The Rome that defeated Hannibal, that conquered the Mediterranean? That Rome was built on a culture of self-sufficiency, citizen farmers who worked their own land and fought their own battles. The historian Livy wrote that early Roman generals would sometimes return from victory and go straight back to plowing their fields. That culture was gone by the imperial period, destroyed by the grain dole. When you grow up never having to produce your own food, never having to compete in a market, never having to worry about your survival, you become fundamentally different. Multiple generations of Romans were raised in a system where work was optional if you were satisfied with subsistence. The state would always provide. Your security came from political patronage, not personal effort. Planning for the future was unnecessary. This created what social scientists call a dependency culture. And here's the dark truth. It was incredibly hard to escape. If you were born into the grain dole system, your neighbors were on it, your family was on it, your whole social world assumed it. Why would you be the one person who tried to opt out and work a farm or learn a trade? The incentive structure pushed everyone toward dependency. And then there were the military consequences. The Roman army had traditionally been drawn from citizen farmers, men who owned property, who had something to fight for. By the late Empire, that recruiting pool had vanished. Increasingly, Rome had to hire barbarian mercenaries, Goths, Vandals, Huns, to defend its borders. Why? Because Roman citizens wouldn't serve. Why risk your life in the military when you could live comfortably in Rome on the grain dole? By 400 AD, the Roman army was majority non-Roman. And those barbarian soldiers looked around and thought, why are we protecting these people who don't work, who don't fight, who just collect free grain? The answer, increasingly, was, we shouldn't. Some historians argue the grain dole didn't just weaken Rome's military capacity, it created the barbarian armies that eventually conquered it, because Rome had to pay foreign warriors to defend the population that had been made soft by state dependency. So here's the question. Could this have been stopped? Were there moments when Rome could have reversed course? The answer is probably yes. Several emperors tried. Augustus cut the rolls from 320,000 to 200,000. Julius Caesar cut them to 150,000, but neither made the cuts permanent. The numbers always crept back up. The problem was political courage. Any emperor who seriously tried to end the grain dole would face immediate riots, loss of popular support, likely assassination or coup. So even strong emperors who understood the problem couldn't solve it. The closest anyone came was Emperor Aurelian, who tried to replace the grain dole with a system of paid work. You'd receive food, but you'd have to labor on public projects. He was assassinated before he could implement it. The grain dole had become what economists call capture, a system that benefits a concentrated group, recipients, while spreading costs across everyone else, taxpayers. Those who benefit fight harder to keep it than those who pay fight to end it. It's a trap that civilizations fall into again and again. But here's what's fascinating. The Eastern Roman Empire, which became the Byzantine Empire, survived another 1,000 years after the West fell. Why? One major reason: Constantinople never created a grain dole as extensive as Rome's. Yes, they had food distributions during emergencies, but it was never permanent, never universal, never unconditional. Byzantine citizens largely had to work for their living, and that meant a productive tax base, agricultural self-sufficiency, a culture of work and commerce, more money for military defense. The Byzantine Empire had many problems, but it never trapped itself the way Rome did. It's one of history's most striking natural experiments. Same civilization, same culture, same starting point. But one made dependency permanent and died. The other kept citizens productive and endured. So what can we learn from Rome's grain dole? First, good intentions aren't enough. Gaius Gracchus genuinely wanted to help the poor. The grain dole seemed like a reasonable solution to a real problem. But good intentions created a system that eventually harmed everyone, including the people it was meant to help. Second, temporary programs become permanent. The grain dole was supposed to be a crisis measure. It lasted 600 years. Once people come to depend on something, it becomes almost impossible to remove, even when everyone can see it's causing harm. Third, there are always trade-offs. The grain dole gave Romans food security, but it took away agricultural self-sufficiency, fiscal flexibility, cultural resilience, and eventually, the civilization itself. Every policy has costs. The question is whether we're honest about them. Fourth, dependency is self-reinforcing. Each generation raised on the grain dole made the next generation more dependent. After a few centuries, Romans didn't even have the cultural memory of self-sufficiency. Breaking free became not just economically difficult, but psychologically impossible. Fifth, systems become too big to fail. By the end, everyone knew the grain dole was bankrupting Rome, but stopping it would have caused immediate collapse. So they kept going, hoping somehow it would work out. It didn't. Now, here's where we need to be careful. I'm not arguing that all social programs are bad. I'm not saying governments shouldn't help people. What I am saying is this: the grain dole shows us the danger of creating permanent, universal, unconditional dependency on the state for basic survival needs. And if we're honest, we can see echoes of this pattern in the modern world. Countries that have created extensive welfare states sometimes struggle with declining workforce participation, unsustainable fiscal burdens, cultures where work is seen as optional, benefits that become politically impossible to reform. I'm not going to name specific countries or programs. That's not the point. The point is that Rome's experience offers a warning. Systems designed to help can end up creating dependency that's worse than the original problem. And the longer those systems run, the harder they are to change. Not because they're working well, but because they've become structural, embedded in the culture, the economy, the expectations of millions of people. So, what's the alternative? How do you help people without creating dependency? History suggests a few principles. First, help should be temporary by design. Roman emperors who gave one-time grain distributions rarely created problems. It was making it permanent that caused the damage. Modern equivalents might be emergency relief, time-limited assistance, or help tied to specific crises. Second, preserve the connection between work and reward. The grain dole severed that connection. Better approaches maintain incentives to work, either through work requirements or by ensuring that working always provides significantly more than not working. Third, don't make dependency comfortable. This sounds harsh, but it's practical. The grain dole provided enough to live on, so many Romans didn't bother working. If assistance is deliberately modest, enough to prevent starvation or homelessness, but not enough for a comfortable life, people retain incentive to improve their situation. Fourth, strengthen families and communities, not just individuals. The grain dole was given to individuals based on citizenship alone. This weakened family bonds and community structures. Better systems might channel help through families, or require community involvement, or build social capital rather than just transferring resources. Fifth, maintain productive capacity. Rome's fatal mistake was letting its agricultural base collapse. Any society that loses the ability to produce what it needs becomes vulnerable. Modern nations that outsource too much production, that let manufacturing bases decline, that become dependent on foreign supply chains, they're repeating Rome's mistake, not with grain, but with energy, microchips, pharmaceutical ingredients, rare earth minerals. Dependency is dependency, regardless of what you're dependent on.
The grain dole provided enough to live on, so many Romans didn't bother working. If assistance is deliberately modest, enough to prevent starvation or homelessness, but not enough for a comfortable life, people retain incentive to improve their situation. Fourth, strengthen families and communities, not just individuals. The grain dole was given to individuals based on citizenship alone. This weakened family bonds and community structures. Better systems might channel help through families, or require community involvement, or build social capital rather than just transferring resources. Fifth, maintain productive capacity. Rome's fatal mistake was letting its agricultural base collapse. Any society that loses the ability to produce what it needs becomes vulnerable. Modern nations that outsource too much production, that let manufacturing bases decline, that become dependent on foreign supply chains, they're repeating Rome's mistake, not with grain, but with energy, microchips, pharmaceutical ingredients, rare earth minerals. Dependency is dependency, regardless of what you're dependent on.
But let's not lose sight of the human dimension here. The grain dole wasn't just an economic policy failure, it was a human tragedy. Think about what it did to individual Romans. Imagine being born in 300 AD in Rome. Your father received the grain dole, your grandfather received it, everyone you know receives it. You've never seen anyone farm, you've never had to work for food, you don't know anyone who has. What kind of person does that make you? You have no skills, no sense of self-efficacy, no understanding that your actions can determine your outcome. When the grain finally stops coming in 410 AD during the siege, you don't know how to plant crops, you don't know how to hunt, you barely know how to bake the grain into bread. You're helpless. And here's the tragedy. It's not your fault. You didn't choose this system, you were born into it. But you're the one who suffers when it collapses. The grain dole didn't just destroy Rome's economy and military, it destroyed millions of individual human potentials. People who might have been farmers, craftsmen, merchants, innovators, instead became passive recipients, their capabilities atrophied through generations of disuse. When we talk about dependency, we're not just talking about budgets and incentives. We're talking about what happens to human beings when you remove their need and therefore their opportunity to develop their capabilities. So here we are, 1600 years after the fall of Rome, and the grain dole remains one of history's most important cautionary tales. Not because government assistance is always wrong, but because it shows us how a reasonable-seeming solution to a genuine problem can, over time, create catastrophe. The grain dole teaches us that time matters. What works for 50 years might destroy you over 500 years. That political incentives matter. What's popular isn't always what's wise. That second-order effects matter. Feeding people seems purely good until you realize it's destroying agriculture, bankrupting the state, and making your civilization vulnerable. That culture matters. Change the incentive structure for long enough, and you change who people are. That path dependency matters. Once you go far enough down a road, turning back becomes impossible, even when everyone can see the cliff ahead. And, perhaps most importantly, that civilizations rarely die from single catastrophic failures. They die from slow accumulations of small compromises, each one seeming reasonable at the time. The barbarians didn't destroy Rome. Rome destroyed itself, slowly over centuries, through policies that seemed compassionate and wise, but that gradually hollowed out everything that had made Rome strong. The grain dole was passed in 123 BCE to help the poor. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. That's 599 years, 6 centuries of slow decline, 6 centuries where everyone could see the problems building, but no one had the courage or the ability to stop it. That's the real lesson. Not that help is bad, but that well-intentioned systems, once created, develop their own momentum. They create constituencies who depend on them, bureaucracies that administer them, and cultures that assume them. And then, even when they start causing more harm than good, they become nearly impossible to change, until finally, they collapse under their own weight, taking the civilization with them. The law that slowly ruined an entire civilization. The Lex Sempronia Frumentaria, Rome's grain dole. Passed with the best intentions, maintained for 600 years, and ultimately one of the contributing factors in the fall of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And if we listen carefully to Rome's story, we might avoid writing the same ending ourselves. So, thanks for watching. If this deep dive into history's cautionary tales interested you, there are more stories like this, laws that seemed brilliant but had devastating unintended consequences waiting to be told. What should we examine next?